That was CGTN's Megan Pratt's reporting. Now let's turn to our panel. Joining us from Montreal, Robyn Maynard is author of the book Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada, From Slavery to the President. From Toronto, Wong is a Canadian journalist and author. From the U.S. state of Michigan, Ronald Hall is a professor in the School of Social Work at Michigan State University. And with us in the studio, Ray Baker is host of the Public Agenda podcast, which examines politics, race and social justice. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ronald, let me start with you in Lansing, Michigan. You know, looking at that report we played out there at the beginning of the show, we can see how endemic racist behavior, racism is in the United States. We see this because of new technology, because of cell phones, which record these things right now. And we have seen how much of this is perpetrated by police here in the United States. Now, we know this has been around for centuries, but is it because of this new technology that the world at large, society at large, is now becoming aware of how endemic this problem is?
Yes, I think technology has a great deal to do with what we might consider the exacerbation of racism. But I also might add, I've spent the last decade, I've covered the world, visited every major racial population, and I find that racism is existent everywhere. So it's something that may be exacerbated sometimes in the U.S., and the visibility of what happens here by way of technology gives the appearance that it's more of a problem here, but in fact, I'm sad to say that it's pretty much become a norm worldwide.
Yeah, we have seen that around the world. Ray, when we look at what's going on in the United States right now, sometimes when we become aware of an issue like this, of a problem like this, it motivates people to change. It motivates people to implement change. Are we seeing that?
Well, we hope that we will see it soon. We know that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s was excited about using broadcast media to put into people's homes exactly what African Americans in the South were facing when going up against issues trying to vote, when trying to have issues where they wanted to sit at the same lunch counter. But what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that there are those who will watch these videos and will still conclude that for some reason, it is still the victim's fault. When we saw Walter Scott get shot in South Carolina, people said, well, he shouldn't have ran. When we saw Tamir Rice get shot in Ohio, people said, well, he shouldn't have been playing with a toy gun that wasn't clearly marked and labeled. And there was even a juror in Michael Slayer, the guy who shot Walter Scott in South Carolina, who said, I will never convict a cop. So what we have to do, now that we have this evidence in front of us, we have to be at our best and be honest as to what we're seeing to provide justice for all Americans and all people.
Of course, when we look at these videos, Ray, we've also seen that trope about we don't know what happened before this happened. And there was a great piece, actually, on a online website called The Intercept by Sean King, in which he said, well, people don't walk around filming things all the time. There's a point they take their cameras out when they see something going wrong, so you'd never know what happened before.
Right, that's absolutely correct. And those who say, well, we don't know what happened before, are those who want to err on the side of the police must not be wrong. We have a complex here in the United States particularly, but perhaps across the world, where those in authority are given the benefit of the doubt in times when evidence suggests they should not be.
Okay, let's go to Robyn. Let's bring her in from Montreal. And Robyn, we just saw that video of that racist rant in a Canadian restaurant. And it's not the kind of picture one has of Canada. You know, the normal picture of Canada is that it's this tolerant, liberal country where, you know, everybody gets along together. But clearly, racism is an issue in Canada because the government in Canada has actually instituted what's been termed a consultation on race issues. It's part of a $23 billion strategy, anti-racism strategy in Canada. How serious is the problem there?
The problem is incredibly important for facing the realities of Black communities and Indigenous communities in Canada. While Canada has an excellent international reputation for multiculturalism and diversity, we need to remember that Canada has a history of over 200 years of slavery, a history of genocide against Indigenous communities, and we are still living in those legacies today when we look at ongoing discrimination of the over-incarceration of Black and Indigenous communities, the fact that Black and Indigenous communities are far more likely to be killed at the hands of police, the fact that our communities continue to be disproportionately targeted and impacted by the child welfare system, by structural poverty more broadly. So we really need to realize that this ongoing and systemic racism that I trace throughout my own work, really, as the way that it's impacted Black communities for centuries is something that needs to be taken seriously. And it's important that we move past the outward appearance of Canada as a home of racial tolerance, when in fact racism remains the status quo.
Jan, here we have a country like Canada, which has its population 20% foreign-born. In fact, that is the most in any one of the G8 countries. And if we look at Canada, people of color occupy some of the highest positions in government. A 2017 survey that was done shows that a quarter of Canadians have experienced some kind of racism. Why is that number so high in Canada? You know, as I said, a country that's often viewed as this bastion of tolerance.
I think it's because we're a rapidly changing society. In Toronto, where I live half the year, it's 50% racial minorities. But I disagree with the first two guests, maybe even your third guest, because I think that the reaction of the public to these kind of cell phone videos is shock and horror, and it's actually really great. They go viral for a reason, and I think that ordinary people, a lot of my friends don't understand that sometimes I go through things. And I know that when somebody says to me, you know, where were you born, that's a slight microaggression, but if they tell me to go back to where I came from, I'm kind of flabbergasted, and I keep thinking of what should I say, because of course my family has been here for more than 100 years, 140 years, I think, if my math is correct, and when you've been here that long, your math gene is no longer very strong. But I just think we're in a period of rapid change. Canada is a society undergoing rapid change, and the social media is really a wonderful tool for fighting this kind of everyday racism.
But I want to ask you about this, Jan. It's a point we made at the beginning of the show as well, and that is, you know, we see these videos, and as you say, shock, horror, but is it shock, horror for a few days, and then it's back to life as usual?
I think it's shock, horror, but that slow drip, drip, drip will actually make a difference in the long run. I think that when people see the behavior of others, that makes them also question themselves. So I don't think we're going to get used to it. I think it's going to change things.
Okay, Ronald, go ahead.
Well, I was about to say, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I'm not really encouraged by the fact that this media technology has exposed more of the racism worldwide. Really what we're dealing with here is an economic issue. And until we remove the economics of racism, unfortunately, the technology can advance, can modify, but it's still going to be a transgression in society at large. There's a historian professor at Princeton named Nell Painter, and she wrote a book called The History of White People. And what shocked me about that book was the fact that when Europeans arrived as settlers to the U.S., there was no racial tension. It was all along class lines. Therefore, African-American persons, Native persons, and poor white persons got along fine. And unfortunately, at times, they would raid the plantations and the farms of the 1 or 2% wealthy Europeans and take advantage of them. And those individuals realized that they had one of two options. They could return to Europe, or they had to convince working-class white Americans to identify with them to increase their numbers. And as a result of that, poor Irish, poor British, poor Dutch became not British, Irish, and Dutch, but they became white. They gave them a few more privileges. They could vote, they could carry weapons, which they did not allow people of color to do. And that kind of exploitation of the Euro-American working class continues to this day. And so you have individuals, for example, who are in Appalachia, who need health care, are in opposition to Obamacare because they identify their political status not in terms of the economics of it, but in terms of being white.
An important thing to consider also, though, is that as we examine what's happening today, in the United States particularly, racism has not manifested itself as exclusively a poor white disease, if we will. Many Americans, like to think of themselves as though more affluent and college-educated white Americans are not as racist as those that they consider less educated and less well-off with finances. Also, there's this idea that young people will be significantly less racist. But research done by Sean McElwee has shown that millennials are, quote, just as racist as their parents, close quote.
Yes.
We've also found that an overwhelming number of high-income Americans voted for, well, particularly high-income white Americans, voted for President Trump, which in the United States serves as a bellwether or proxy as to how one feels about those who are not white people. And so while valuable to consider the history of whiteness and otherness, it's important to consider where we are right now and not limit this to racism as something simply for poor white Americans.
Robyn, what is your view on this?
Something else that's important to remember is that if we think about the visibility right now of these videos that are capturing these racist incidents, we need to remember that the Rodney King riots were something that took place in the 1990s. So we've had in many ways a visibility of black people losing their lives at the hands of police, of all kinds of other racist incidents for a long time. But what we have not seen, despite the visibility and the outrage that occurs, is a commitment to institutional change, is a commitment to what happens after police kill, is a commitment to actually ensuring that there would be any justice served for the victims, is any commitment to actually ending the practice of racial profiling and racially disproportionate police stops. So what you have is the ongoing reality of often what is not televised, which, coming from a community work background in earlier years, I remember so often conversing, for example, with black youth who would talk about even just, trying to wait for the subway in groups of 3 or more. They would be split up by the police because they were facing suspicion of being a gang. So until we actually make this kind of policing not only intolerable, but actually, institutionally no longer allowed, we're not going to see any of the necessary and systemic changes that are required.
Jan, you were telling us a moment ago about the fact that a lot of this is taking place because society is changing so fast right now and so radically. And I'm wondering, what is your view on how economic conditions contribute to racism? And if we take the United States, for instance, a lot has been happening here. We've got a widening income gap, we've got a widening wealth gap, and this is not particularly along race lines, it could be across that. And we see the emergence of a leader like Donald Trump come into power. How does that all, and plus we're seeing changing demographics in the United States as well, a big change. How does all that contribute to what we are seeing?
Well, I think, as the other guests have said, race and class are very important and they're intertwined. And I think that in Canada, and if you just go to downtown Toronto at lunchtime and you go into a food court, you will see people all sitting together of all different groups. And if you go into the schools, you'll see people together. I think it's a process. I think racism occurs when you don't know the other group. I mean, there's many reasons for racism, but one problem is when the races are segregated. As soon as we get integrated and you get to know each other, I think that solves half the problem. I agree with Robyn. We need to have systemic change, but a lot of it has to take place on the one-on-one level, people getting to know one another. And I think that's pretty good in Toronto. In the workplace in Toronto, I think we're getting integrated.
Ronald, there was a report produced recently by the United Nations Rapporteur on racism in the United Kingdom. You were talking about the fact that this is not a problem that's unique to the United States or Canada. We see it around the world. And this particular report that said that post-Brexit there has been a distinct growth in, quote, explicit racial, ethnic and religious intolerance. And this, of course, includes the emergence of extremist groups in the United Kingdom, which some of these groups have actually made it into mainstream political parties. This is not uniquely British, and we've seen it in other parts of the world, in other European countries as well, haven't we?
Yes, and you might also be shocked to know that typically individuals we think of as victims of racism also act out racist behaviors. So when I talked about this 20 years ago, I was called to testify as an expert witness in what became America's first case of skin color discrimination between African Americans in Morrow versus the Internal Revenue Service. We find that in 1980, Felix versus Menquez, which was a Latino population, which also engaged in discrimination along skin color lines. So even persons who we would expect that would be victims of racism act out these racist behaviors based upon the historical colonial experience. So again, I get back to the economics of it. Until we take the benefit out of racism, unfortunately, it's going to be manifest, nuanced a little differently between different groups, but the behavior itself is going to still be existent.
I think it's interesting that that Dr. Hall's talked
I'll
about.
come to you in a moment, Jan.
I think it's
Go
interesting he talked about the economic nuance of racism, and I want to go back to something that Robyn alluded to earlier about the systemic nature of it. So often, when we think about racism, we only apply either individual racism, which is person-to-person interaction, or institutional racism. But in the United States, to use a bit of a colloquialism, it is baked into our macaroni and cheese. And so it's intrinsically there. And so whether someone likes me or not makes no difference if they work for the bank that disproportionately does not approve loans for African Americans with high credit scores and high income. So whether someone is kind enough to me at the grocery store and lets me in front of them at Whole Foods, or whether or not any of these things does not matter if I don't get a job because my name sounds too ethnic. And so these are some of the institutional things that we have to account for. Like the fact that the Fair Housing Act of 1968 here in the United States is at its 50th anniversary, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development is treating fair housing as one of its worst ways that we've ever seen since that 50 years. And so this idea of institutional racism is so important, and it speaks to what Dr. Hall was alluding to, where we find those who would otherwise be the victims also seeing themselves as the perpetrators.
And it starts at a very early age, doesn't it? If we look at the expenditure, say, for instance, in areas which are predominantly black, it starts there. If we look at admissions to institutions of higher learning, you mentioned places where people can buy homes, etc. It starts and grows from there.
Everything that we've seen, particularly with regard to the housing crisis here in the United States that took hold particularly in the late aughts of the 2000s, when we see now that home values in black neighborhoods or high-income African Americans still aren't measuring the home values of white Americans in places where the income controls are all comparable. These are the institutional questions that we must resolve before we look for anything else.
I just wanted to address Anand's point of far-right parties becoming elected in Europe, and Brexit, after Brexit in the UK, the far-right fringe groups are coming out. I mean, I think in Canada we have the same problem. There's always a far-right fringe group. We have a provincial election going on right now in the province of Ontario, where Toronto is, and our Conservative candidate has said some racist things. And so I think it's always just simmering beneath the surface. And then, so those daily videos of racist occurrences, all of this helps. It keeps it in the conversation. And because we have a 24-hour news feed now, when a political leader says something, there's an immediate backlash. And actually, they do have to back down in Canada. They don't get away with it. But that's just because people speak up here.
Right. Robyn?
Well, I would disagree with that as well. I think that the fact that those things don't happen here is really just misunderstanding the situation. For example, you know, we're talking about the global nature, for example, of anti-blackness, where we're seeing the deportation of the Windrush generation in the United Kingdom. We're seeing the expulsion of 60,000, the possible deportation of 60,000 Haitians after the removal of the temporary protected status in the United States. What we're also seeing is that, you know, the significant numbers of Haitians that are crossing from the United States into Canada to seek asylum here are also, as of the last numbers that have come out, 90% of them are going to face deportation from Canada as well. So I think we need to remember that although Canada perhaps has a different way of articulating itself and articulating again always this commitment to racial tolerance, what we still see is a country where there's no maximum on immigration detention. So we see black and other racialized migrants, you know, in detention centers for 5 years, 10 years in situations like that, but it just remains under the surface. And I also wanted to address the idea that I think that this proximity to each other means that, you know, racism is being dismantled, because I think about, you know, it is a beautiful thing that we see children of many different racial backgrounds, for example, in schools together. But if we don't address the fact that, you know, a 6-year-old girl was handcuffed, her hands and feet together in her school, if we don't address the fact that black students are being disproportionately expelled and suspended, then for all of those positive interactions that those students are having, we're not addressing the very real violent situations that black youth continue to face. So really just to bring it back to the absolute necessity of recognizing that institutional discrimination that is ongoing.
Ray, if we look at that very specific issue of police violence on black people, there was an editorial in today's New York Times this morning, this is Wednesday here in the United States, published an editorial in which it called for the mayor, Bill de Blasio, to fire the policeman responsible for the killing of Eric Garner. You remember that case where Eric Garner was selling cigarettes outside a store in Staten Island in New York. Police arrived, they used, they basically killed him.
They did.
Yeah.
They did.
Will the mayor act? Will he fire the policeman? Or is politics going to get in the way?
So we'll say this, right? I don't want to speak on behalf of the mayor, but we can say that precedent in the United States suggests that that police officer will not be fired. If he is, then that'll be a shock and a first step toward justice, particularly for the Garner family, who Eric lost his daughter Erica, and she had spent her entire life advocating for social justice around her father's death, but for African Americans in New York and beyond. The question really here, and I think Robyn alluded to it, is how do we seek justice? When any citizen commits an act against another citizen, more or less we seek justice for that person. Yet when police, law enforcement, particularly in the United States, commit violent acts against African Americans overwhelmingly, but now we're seeing incidences against white Americans as well, we're not seeking justice. We're not seeing justice. And until we can start to see that justice, then we will see a change in behavior. But overwhelmingly, whether we're talking about cities that have African American leadership or cities that are very diverse, to Jan's point, New York City is one of the most diverse cities in the United States, has a large cross-section of different ethnicities working there, but Akai Gurley, who was walking in an apartment building and had a loud boom when a door closed, was shot and killed by a Chinese-American officer, and that officer faced no jail time. What then do we say if there's no justice following these incidences?
In Canada, I think we had a police officer who shot a brown-skinned man. He was mentally ill. He was on a streetcar. And that officer was convicted of attempted murder. He killed him. He was exonerated of murder, but convicted of attempted murder. He has a long prison sentence. I think it's changing a little bit, and I would say that Canada is better than the U.S. I've lived and worked in the U.S., and we are better. There's no question about that. We have a lot of problems, as Robyn said, but it's not the same.
You know, talking about change, Jan, officials in the Canadian city of Vancouver, that's another very diverse city, they've apologized for the city's racist past with regards to its citizens of Chinese descent. This is what the mayor of Vancouver had to say. Let's watch.
The living legacies of the injustices against Chinese people in Vancouver still resonate with us today. They echo in our city, in our collective histories, and in the stories of our elders. I rise today to acknowledge and address a dark and difficult period of our past.
So, Jan, do you think there is a good faith effort now being made to redress these issues?
Yes, I do. The irony is, of course, most of the Chinese Canadians now in Vancouver have no idea what he's talking about. But my grandfather was one of those in the province of British Columbia who had, you know, his wife had to pay the head tax. He was discriminated against. He went through all that. And that's history, and it's really nice to have an apology.
Right.
But the most important thing is what's happening today.
Let me get to Ronald. Ronald, I know you want to say something.
Well, I wanted to mention the issue of this being baked into our macaroni and cheese. I think we forget that persons of color, normally victims of discrimination, racism, evolve in the same socio-cultural environment. So we should not expect that as individual victims that we would be aloof from acting out discriminatory behaviors. When I start a class at the beginning of a semester, I frequently ask students to raise their hand if you are racist, a sexist, or a homophobe. And frequently, I am the only one who will raise my hand. That's not something that I'm proud of, but I evolved in a racist, sexist, homophobic culture. And to think that I don't have those tendencies is just not really true. And as long as you can't own what you are guilty of, then, you know, the problem, I think, is going to be, unfortunately, perpetuated.
That's a great point,
Yeah.
and I think we're just quickly about that, and that's why we're here for the segment, right? This question of everyday racism.
Right.
Because many Americans, particularly, think themselves, I'm not a police officer who shoots an unarmed African American. I've never hung anyone. I've never specifically done this one terrible thing that we think of to count as racism. But if we function in the United States as people who are groomed by the culture and norms of the United States, particularly if you were of the privileged class, you were going to have all of the assumptions and behaviors of the privileged class. And that's why such things as existing while black seems now to be an issue where it's worth having the police called upon you. Because if you are a person of privilege, particularly white people here in the United States, a black person is in my space doing a thing I'm not accustomed to. That is problematic. And that is what the doctor is alluding to when he talks about we've come up in this place with these cultural and social norms.
Lots more to talk about, but we're going to have to end it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America, or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.